Welcome to the Lean Startup Company webcast series. In today's webcast, Heather McGough, co-founder of Lean Startup Company, will be interviewing Erwin Godoy, former Special Advisor for Innovation to the Director of Plans and Programs of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Take it away, Heather and Erwin.
I'd like to welcome Erwin Godoy today. Erwin just completed 2 years of recall to active duty as Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserve at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, where he served as Special Advisor for Innovation to the Director of Plans and Programs. Erwin is an entrepreneur and innovation scholar. Early in his career, Erwin spent time working on the future of warfare and how technology would change how militaries compete. NGA is a combat support agency within the Department of Defense, responsible for getting the right geospatial data to the right groups to enable decisions, whether it's special forces in Afghanistan, supporting hurricanes or humanitarian efforts, or policymakers who need to make foreign and defense policy. The Department of Defense's mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and to protect the security of our country. Erwin, it's an honor to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Heather. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on how Lean Startup can help the Department of Defense.
Of course. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Erwin, given the mission of the Department of Defense, why do you view Lean Startup as a national security imperative?
Sure. So if you look at the mission of the Department of Defense, right, it's to deploy forces to protect our national security, right, to make sure that we have a properly equipped Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and all the supporting agencies. But if we take a step back and look at how Eric Ries defines a startup, right, as an institution operating under high uncertainty, the Department of Defense right now is an institution operating under extremely high uncertainty. And why do I say extremely high uncertainty? It's because the rate of technological change is disrupting the way we interact with potential adversaries, or what in the DoD we call peer competitors, other militaries that could be a threat to us. So if you look at, for example, let's take ISIS, for example, how they use social media to have great campaigns to mobilize their attackers in different cities. They don't even know the people who they are inspiring to do these horrible attacks. Or if we look at, the hacking of our elections by what we believe to be the Russians. So technology is really changing the way countries and their militaries interact and compete and how we defend. So therefore, the Defense Department and the military services are in a period where we need to start identifying how are we going to fight in the future? How do we defend the American population differently? Is an aircraft carrier going to help you to defend against ISIS? Okay, maybe you can attack their shanties in Syria or in Yemen, but how does it help you attack a cyber threat or an aircraft squadron? These are military forces, military formations that we've had for numerous years. So what I think that Lean Startup brings is the ability to rapidly experiment. Take these different technologies, try to see what new doctrines, what new frameworks, what new force formations work, experiment to develop new options to be able to leverage these new technologies, how to address these new threats. So if it's the ability to really experiment and quick learning that Lean Startup brings, that I think it's an imperative, because we need to have options as the technologies mature and becomes more clear, rather than locking in to one technology or one type of force formation that might prove the wrong thing.
Can you provide a historical example of when the principles of Lean Startup were used successfully?
Sure, and this is really fascinating because believe it or not, the principles of rapid experimentation, iteration, learning, rapid feedback loops were used in the interwar period, and that interwar period being the period between World War I and World War II, right? So most of us, that's about 85 years ago, we're like, whoa, this Lean Startup stuff, didn't come about till maybe the past 10 years with the advent of the digital economy. But the fact of the matter is that both the German Army and the US Navy realized there was this thing occurring during that period. Motorization was occurring. If you look at the way World War I was fought, it was in the trenches. You still had a lot of horse-drawn carts. Maybe you had some biplanes that did have some aerial fighting, aerial reconnaissance. Tanks started to come in and help some breakthrough, but there really wasn't much motorization. The automobile was just coming of age. So you fast forward in the 20s and the 30s, society starts changing completely. Yeah. In terms of now you have cars, you have vehicles, you have airplanes, you have airliners. So let's take, for example, the German army. The German army realized that, wait a minute, this is going to change warfare completely. How do we use aircraft? How do we use tanks? How do we use radio? Radio didn't exist in the First World War. It's very, very, very brand new. How do we use these things to fight in the battlefield differently? So they began to first experiment with their doctrine, not even having the actual tanks, because one thing that happened to the German army is the Treaty of Versailles imposed some harsh conditions on their buildup of their military and their economy. So they weren't able to rearm till the late 30s. So what the German army realized is like, hey, we need to start understanding, take the lessons of World War I and seeing how this technology is going to change the battlefield. So they started first observing other militaries. Second, taking the lessons and start evolving a doctrine and developing assumptions and hypotheses off of that doctrine, which when they had the opportunity to begin experimenting and start rearming, they started rapidly experimenting with large formations and field exercises to see what will work in this new battlefield. The US Navy, very similar. At the same time, you had the aircraft carriers. The Navy had invested in 2 aircraft carriers, the Lexington and the Saratoga, in, I think, 1917, 1919, early 1920s. And one thing they needed to see is aircraft to mature in terms of speed, range, and payload, how much weight that they could actually carry. But they started realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's something here to being able to launch attacks from an aircraft carrier. So the Navy, actually prior to the Navy, the US Army Air Corps, under General Billy Mitchell, started realizing, hey, this thing, air power, is going to change the dynamics of warfare. And he decided to hold an experiment to show that aircraft could sink a battleship. So off the coast of Panama in the 1920s, he took an old captured German battleship and he decided to raid it and bomb it. And they realized, wait a minute. So we proved our hypothesis. Assumption was that an aircraft could sink a battleship. That was the most critical assumption to test. They tested that and they validated that. So now they start being able to say, okay, let's start seeing what happens off of aircraft carriers, and started holding these fleet exercises and fake bombing raids on the Panama Canal, even on Pearl Harbor in the early 1930s, before actual Pearl Harbor actually happened. So you have occurring in these 2 militaries is that you're creating options by rapid experimentation, and they both had rapid feedback loops in which they were validating the learning to see what worked and what didn't work. So when you look back at this, you find very interesting, wait a minute, the military has done this already before. You know, it was lean startup by another name. You could call it rapid experimentation.
What enabled the military institutions to successfully adopt the principles of lean startup and rapid experimentation?
Sure. You know, it wasn't without their challenges. They had the similar cultural challenges that we face today, or any large enterprises faces today in trying to adopt the new methodology. What enabled the German army was the fact that their economy was tanked. They really didn't have much of a defense budget. They were the underdog, if you think about it. So they knew they had to learn. They weren't encumbered by large amounts of money. And as the ones that being defeated, they knew they had to learn. Now there was a turn of events in which they brought the right leadership. They brought the right head of the German General Staff, which was a group of thinkers that were created at the high command of the German army, whose job was to think and provide intellectual leadership on the changing nature of warfare. So the head of the General Staff, General von Seeckt, started appointing young leaders who could learn, whose focus was on intellectual leadership and execution at the same time. and then being able to start developing a concept of doctrine. They didn't have the tanks to experiment. So for all intents and purposes, they had to start with paper mock-ups to do their doctrine. So they were helped by the fact that they were the underdogs. Now, yes, there were a lot of detractors within the German army who thought about the old way. So it wasn't without the institutional barriers, but that made it a bit easier for the Germans. The American Navy was a little bit more difficult because the American Navy had the battleship admirals. The battleship reigned supreme, had reigned supreme for hundreds of years, going back to the British Navy, as the way that you fought wars in blue oceans. That means in the deep sea. That is what gave you global power and global force projection, was the battleship. So if you think somebody like Billy Mitchell in the Army, he actually was court-martialed. He was court-martialed for being an innovator because he was a risk taker. He didn't care what the leadership were saying. He believed that this was a threat and he needed to test, and he took actions that weren't always, he was going against orders to do those actions, but to test. Now, I'm not recommending that we do that, right, as a reserve military officer. But you found that also in the Navy. Billy Mitchell was the Army Air Corps. Then you had in the Navy. I think what enabled the Navy was the fact that, again, having the right folks in leadership, the ability to test, and the fact that they started small. They started small, looking for quick wins. And these field exercises, they started getting those wins. So what the U.S. Navy did is it developed options, because Pearl Harbor was an eye-opener. Whoa, this could happen from aircraft carriers. As if you think about it, that's when the aircraft carrier first hit the market. It's a horrible way to think, but that's where you saw the first combat. But then you had the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Coral Sea, when there was aircraft carrier against aircraft carrier, Japanese aircraft carrier against U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. And we saw the supremacy, and this is a new way of fighting wars. But the implications are so interesting, because if you think about it, what happened from there, the French and the British, who were probably the preeminent militaries, aside from the German prior to World War I, lost their supremacy. The British were no longer a global power after World War II. You know, the Germans, the only reason the Germans did not conquer Europe was because they did not take into account their supply lines. And the Americans were quick to learn. So,
well, you mentioned rogue innovators being disciplined. I think there was a story Eric told when he went into an organization, and he was essentially looking for the people who would be open to working in this new way, and perhaps even leaders. And I believe, as the story goes, he said, give me the list of everyone that's been written up in the past, 2 years. Those are the people that I want to talk to.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned barriers, Erwin. What obstacles do today's defense agencies face in using these experimental methods?
I think one of them is that we have too much money. I believe in our military. I believe in having a prepared Department of Defense, but I think the fact is that we have too much money.
Sure.
And when we have too much money, it makes it difficult to do these small experiments. We want to go large. You couple that with a large bureaucracy, right, and old ways of thinking. I think the bureaucracy tends to hinder those innovators, and you try to throw more money at the problem rather than starting small-scale experimenting. I think the other thing is having this mindset, not having the mindset of rapid iterative experimentation. And the Department of Defense has gotten where we focus too much on, well, what are the requirements? Before I build something or do anything, I need to define requirements so I can let out some sort of contract. Rather than, okay, let's go find what those future battlefield needs are. We don't know what the requirements are going to be. But there's such a mindset, give me requirements first. If I don't have the requirements first, I'm not going to go build. So I think that's a mindset. We need to move away from requirements to discovery of new battlefield needs. I think there's also too much focus on tech insertion. There's a lot of confusion that innovation is new technology. What you learn from the German case, for example, is that it's the business model. that makes a difference. It's not necessarily the new technology, right? How do you apply a new business model to that technology? Well, in military terms, what's that business model? It's the doctrine, it's the different formations, it's the different structures and organizations, it's the different procedures and tactics that military use. The German army's tanks prior to May 10th, 1940, when they invaded France, was inferior to the French and the British. The French and the British already had tanks, they had communications, but they put them in the old doctrine, the old business model. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Germans, experimenting with their doctrine first, what's the business model that's going to work? Then they started inserting the technology to test that. Yeah. And they realized that, wait a minute, rather from a defensive type of war that they fought in World War I, which is what the British and the German wanted to fight, the British and the French wanted to fight, the Germans realized we're faster, we can communicate, we can maneuver. So it's about speed, maneuverability, exploitation, and allowing the lead elements to be able to innovate and maneuver with what they see fit. Completely way of thinking, a completely different business model than what was being used before. So I think that's why right now there's too much focus on, let's look artificial intelligence. Where do we put artificial intelligence? What do we do with cyber? What do we do with this thing called the cloud? Well, we need to take a step back. How does it change the military doctrine? How does it change how we fight? Where do we run those experiments when we start focusing? Wait a minute, this is the new skill set. These are the new organizations. Maybe it could be large organizations like large formations within the military services or small teams. How do small teams work differently with this new technology? And let's experiment with different models than the ones that we currently have. And I think that is a fatal flaw that hurts us, because let's put this technology into the old model. And it's difficult to change doctrine, to change business models, because people get used to a way of working. So therefore, that's the hard change that requires to be made. That's the hard experimentation. It's easy to let's buy this and put it in. But we don't want to fall into the same fate that the British and the French did. While we could have the Chinese and the Russians, who are the underdogs, experimenting with new doctrine and new technology at the same time.
Erwin, how does lean startup look differently in the Department of Defense or government agencies than in the commercial sector?
I think it's not a question of how it looks differently. I think it's different language and different vocabulary that needs to be used. Okay, there might be a case where you can rapidly experiment something with the market or customers, where you put something on you can create a web page and have somebody, be able to see how they engage, interact, to run your MVP and your experiment. But you can still do that with small things in the Department of Defense. I think that what the focus really needs to be is not getting stuck on the words. People hear the word startup. Well, we're Department of Defense. We're not startups. How can you expect something that works for somebody working out of a garage working for us? We can mention the examples of GE into it, and people are like, well, those are commercial companies. And like, okay, so it's a matter of lingo. If we talk about uncertainty, let's talk about lean startup as a method for de-risking and for reducing uncertainty to get to what will actually work, given all these conditions of uncertainty. When you start talking to it that way, it starts, that's very similar. The DoD is an institution under conditions of high uncertainty right now. And so are its support agencies. So why don't we start applying some methodologies that are suited for working under conditions of high uncertainty? We can use the concept of MVP, and that, just like in the commercial sector, in the DoD, it gets bastardized, right? I did an MVP, and people are saying, well, I'm doing things differently because I'm using this cool word, MVP. Rather, okay, it's an experiment. Do you have a hypothesis? Do you have an assumption you're trying to validate? What's that experiment, and what are those outcomes that you want to see, and how do you measure those outcomes? So I think it's an issue of getting to the lingo and the language, because you're still going to be going through the same tenets of lean startup, right? Defining your most critical assumption, setting up that hypothesis, developing that small experiment, have that rapid feedback loop, understand what your outcomes are, and then make decisions based on the data that you get for those outcomes.
Can you share some of the lessons you've learned in using lean startup within the Department of Defense?
Sure. One of the lessons is what we were just talked about. It's the lingo. So I went to NGA as recalled to active duty. I'm a military reservist, and I was recalled to active duty, having had my own startup for a while, and then having worked for a large consulting firm. So I started bringing a lot of the commercial lingo, and people looked at me a little bit weird. I'm like, "What's this lean startup way? What are you talking about?" So it took me sometimes to wait a minute. I need to communicate differently. I need to understand how this culture communicates to be able to communicate what I'm trying to inform and how I'm trying to help them. What's the lingo? What's the language that will work with them? I think that's one thing that I think that is a lesson learned for me. I think the other one is to be able to use small teams and work with quick wins. And we try to do a lot in my experience at NGA. We started to do a lot to begin with, but I think starting with small teams and quick wins, maybe just taking one small team, one cross-functional team, taking it through the lean startup process to actually validate and put something to our internal market and the DoD, then sort of bring those results. When we started doing that, it's when people started paying attention. If we start trying to teach, hey, you should do this, you should do that, it's hard for them to connect. But if you start doing and you start delivering, right? Like Eric Ries says it, right? Don't take my word for it, just do it.
Yeah.
People start paying attention. And I think that's what started drawing momentum when people started seeing the results. And the other thing is that, look, nobody has bad intentions when you're you're dealing with cultural backlash. You have to understand what it is that motivates those people. So the other thing that I would do is sort of start thinking, okay, what is it? How will my audience receive this? How to put myself in their shoes and try to understand what's the job to be done for them. If we use Clay Christensen's job to be done theory, they have a need, and so, okay, how can lean startup satisfy their need? And a good colleague of mine came up to me and said, Erwin, when you start talking about reducing uncertainty, no decision maker is going to say no. You want to de-risk and reduce uncertainty and improve their chances of success. That resonates with people.
Yeah. Yeah, that first lesson especially resonated with me because, over a year ago when we started working with the NGA and the NSA, we definitely did have to adapt to that language. And, I think now we have over 30 teams we're working with. But, that lingo is important. And I think there's even some stigma around certain words, training and others. Well, I know that in part of your previous role, you were bringing Lean Startup into NGA and our defense agencies, wanting to give it momentum. Given that, what did you do well and what would you do differently? And what do you see the state of Lean Startup being within the Department of Defense?
I think one of the things that I did well is one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill: never, never, never give in.
Yeah.
And
that you did not.
I did not give in. I had to find different ways to be able to communicate and get people to start buying in to Lean Startup. I think you need to, when you're going to be an internal entrepreneur, you have to have some level of resiliency. It's not always going to be easy. I mean, look at the case of Billy Mitchell. That he got court-martialed. But if you believe that you're doing something that's more than for yourself, if you believe that this is the right way to go, at least you keep your integrity and you're able to keep pursuing well. I think that's one thing that I was able to do well, to make sure I sort of kept my humility and say it's not about me, it's about the mission, so I can move forward with passion rather than with ego. I think that's very important because people can feel it when you come at it from the ego perspective. I know more than you do, or you just don't get it. I think the other thing that I would do, I think what I did not do so well though, is truly be able to craft what I would call a political strategy. Really set a landscape of what are the stakeholders and where do they all sit. Do sort of customer discovery with them and understand what's the outcome that they're trying to get. I wish I would have done that a lot earlier. Eventually we started getting senior leadership buy-in and we had the right people come in at the right place to enable us to do the things that we wanted to do. There's much work that's still to be done, but I think NGA is on the right path to begin that experimentation. But that political strategy would have been one. And then again, I mentioned it before, starting with small teams. I think we We didn't realize that at first. We're trying to do a lot of classes, but when we started with one small team and that team started to get momentum and people started seeing what they were doing, that went really well. And we've leveraged that team quite heavily to promote the benefits of using this new methodology.
Gosh, we could talk about this all day, but we have time for one last question, Erwin. What practical steps can defense agencies take to leverage these methods?
Sure. I think one is start small. I think that when defense agencies are doing their programming and they're thinking of a new capability, of funding a new capability, rather than thinking in the millions of dollars, they should start in the tens of thousands of dollars or the hundreds of thousands if they need a big number. But they need to start with small funding. They need to take a VC mentality to do seed funding. That is key to be able to enable that, because that forces those internal founders, okay, how do I experimenting? And then outcome-based. It has to be outcome-based on what are the metrics and what are we learning. It focuses too much on cost, schedule, and performance today. I think that I would also say to my colleagues in the DoD, don't get hindered by the word startup. Mm-hmm. It's look at the conditions that you're working under uncertainty, and how do you develop speed to experiment with as many capabilities as possible right now to give you options. It's using option theories. And by having all those options, you're going to be able to understand what will work once you get to a little bit closer of truth of what will work in a new environment. I would focus on the principles of lean startup, the tenets, not on specific tools. Don't get, well, I use a Google Sprint method, or, I do lean startup this way, or I use the business model canvas versus the lean canvas. Those are peripheral tools that help you. Like Eric says, it's not a doctrine. You have to see how you can work within your context and what is it that's going to work for that particular project. In some instances, you might want to do a Google Sprint sort of thing. Maybe in some instances, you want to bring some design thinking, and you need to bring in some design thinking to get closer to truth to what the problem is. Mm-hmm. But don't get stuck on the tools. And I think finally what I would do is send your senior executives to the Lean Startup Conference, because that helped me when I was having a hard time communicating. It's like, hey, okay, why don't you go hear it from other folks? Bring people who can help you to communicate it, so that, and people who have experience, who have been through it, can assist you to sort of put it in different terms. Give you that when you're too close to the fight, you need somebody to step away for a little bit and tell you, hey, you need to approach it in a different way. Or at least let them see the forest for the trees when you send them to the Lean Startup Conference, or any similar conference like that. Or you can even here in DC, there's a Lean Startup meetup. Yeah. Send them to those meetups and start learning how people are using Lean Startup.
Yeah, find your people.
Yeah.
Well, those are some powerful words of advice for our intelligence community. Erwin, I can't thank you enough for your time today. I've had the pleasure of working with you for the last year in the teams that you were overseeing in your former role with the NGA. I'm excited to follow you on your next leg of your innovation journey. And I am one of many who thank you for your service to the Department of Defense. Thanks, Erwin.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate the ability to be able to share how Lean Startup could be used effectively within the DoD and our national security establishment.
Thank you, Erwin.
We hope everyone enjoyed our webcast. If your company is interested in learning more about bringing the entrepreneurial spirit to your large organization, visit us at leanstartup.co and click Education, or email education@leanstartup.co.